The year was 1171. Somewhere on the windswept steppes of Mongolia, a 9-year-old boy watched as the last members of his tribe disappeared over the horizon, leaving him, his mother, and his siblings to die. His father had been poisoned by enemies just days before. Now his own people, the tribe that should have protected them, abandoned the family to the wolves and the merciless winter cold. The boy's name was Temujin. Within 4 decades, the world would know him as Genghis Khan, the man who would build the largest contiguous empire in human history, an empire that would stretch from the Pacific Ocean to the gates of Vienna, an empire responsible for connecting East and West in ways never before imagined, while simultaneously causing the deaths of an estimated 40 million people. But how did this abandoned child become the most feared conqueror the world has ever known? How did a young man with nothing, no tribe, no resources, no army, manage to unite the warring Mongol clans and then systematically destroy some of the most powerful civilizations on Earth? The Jin dynasty, which had ruled northern China for centuries. The Khwarezmian Empire, one of the wealthiest Islamic states in history. The city of Baghdad, the crown jewel of Islamic civilization, home to the famed House of Wisdom. These weren't small kingdoms or insignificant city-states. These were empires with armies numbering in the hundreds of thousands, protected by walls that had stood for generations, defended by military traditions refined over centuries. Yet one by one, they fell before the Mongol onslaught. Cities that had never been conquered were reduced to rubble. Dynasties that seemed eternal vanished within a generation. The story of Genghis Khan is not simply a tale of military conquest. It's a narrative about transformation, how suffering and betrayal can forge either a monster or a visionary leader, and perhaps how Genghis Khan became both. It's about innovation in warfare, about psychological manipulation, about understanding human nature so completely that you can predict exactly how your enemies will react and turn those reactions into weapons against them. This is also a story about contradictions. The same man who ordered the massacre of entire cities also established laws protecting religious freedom and women's rights, unprecedented in the medieval world. The conqueror, who killed millions, also created the conditions for the greatest period of cultural and technological exchange between East and West before the modern era. The illiterate nomad who grew up in a felt tent established a legal code, a postal system, and an administrative structure that would serve as a model for future empires. History has struggled with Genghis Khan. In the West, he's been portrayed as a barbarian, a force of pure destruction sweeping out of the unknown steppes like a natural disaster. In Mongolia, he's a national hero, the founding father who united fractured tribes and put the Mongol people on the world stage. In China, Russia, and the Islamic world, regions that suffered under Mongol rule, the memory remains complicated, mixing grudging respect with deep historical trauma. Who was the real Genghis Khan? What drove him from the moment his father was poisoned to his death at the height of his power? What strategies, innovations, and insights allowed him to accomplish what no other conqueror in history has matched? This is the untold story of the Mongol conquests, not just the battles and the bloodshed, but the psychology, the strategy, the cultural forces, and the historical accidents that allowed one man to change the course of human civilization forever. The Mongol steppes in the 12th century were a landscape that bred hardness. Endless grasslands stretched beneath vast skies, offering nowhere to hide and no mercy for the weak. Survival meant mastering the horse, the bow, and the brutal arithmetic of tribal politics, where today's ally could be tomorrow's executioner. Into this world, around the year 1162, Temujin was born. His father, Yesugei, was a minor chieftain of the Borjigin clan, respectable but not powerful, influential but not wealthy. The Mongol tribes at this time were not a unified nation, but a collection of competing clans, each vying for grazing lands, horses, and prestige. Alliances shifted like the wind. Blood feuds lasted generations. A man's worth was measured in horses, warriors, and sons. Temujin's birth itself became wrapped in legend. According to the secret history of the Mongols, the only primary source written by Mongols themselves, he was born clutching a blood clot in his fist, a sign that he was destined to become a great warrior. Whether this detail is historical fact or retrospective myth-making is impossible to know, but it reveals how even his own people later viewed him, as someone marked by fate from the moment of birth. His early childhood was typical for a Mongol boy of his status. He learned to ride before he could properly walk, learned to shoot a bow from horseback before he could read, because reading was a skill the Mongols had no use for. The bow, the horse, and the endless sky were his classroom. Survival was the curriculum. But in 1171, everything changed. Yasuge traveled to visit the Tatars, a neighboring tribe. The Tatars and Yasuge's people had old grievances, old blood debts that tribal memory kept alive across decades. During the visit, the Tatars recognized Yasuge. They offered him food, a sacred obligation of hospitality on the steppes. But the food was poisoned. Yasuge managed to make it home, but the poison was already working through his system. He died days later, leaving behind a widow, several young children, and no clear succession plan. In Mongol society, a chieftain's death often meant catastrophe for his family if the succession wasn't secure. Temujin, at 9 years old, was too young to command respect. His mother, Hoylan, was an outsider. Yasuge had actually kidnapped her from another man years earlier, a common practice, but one that left her with few tribal allies. What happened next would shape everything Temujin would become. The Taichud clan, who were distant relatives and had shared grazing lands with Yasuge's people, made a calculated decision. They would not support Temujin's claim to leadership. More than that, they would abandon the family entirely. The reasoning was coldly pragmatic. Why share resources with a widow and her children who couldn't contribute to the tribe's military strength? In a society where survival was always uncertain, supporting the weak was a luxury few could afford. Hoylan, Temujin, and his siblings were left behind as the Taichud clan moved to new grazing lands. They took the horses, the herds, everything. The family was left with essentially nothing on the empty steppe. What followed were years that would have broken most people. Hoylan kept her children alive through sheer will, teaching them to dig for wild roots, to fish in the rivers, to hunt marmots and small game. They lived in a condition barely above starvation. There were no herds, no horses, no tribal protection. They were targets for any raiders who might happen upon them. It was during these years of desperate poverty that Temujin committed his first recorded act of violence. One that reveals the darkness taking root in the young boy's soul. Temujin and his brother Kasar went hunting one day and managed to catch a lark and some fish. When they returned to camp, they discovered that their half-brothers, Bekta and Belgutai, had stolen the catch. For a family living on the edge of starvation, this was more than simple theft. It was a threat to survival, but Temujin's response went beyond mere anger. He and Kasar tracked Bekta to a hilltop, where he was watching over the family's small herd of horses. Bekta saw them approaching with their bows drawn. According to the secret history, he didn't run. He sat down and said, "Do not destroy me. You will need me when you are grown." Temujin and Kasar shot him anyway. They killed their own half-brother over stolen food. When they returned to camp, Hoylan was horrified. She berated Temujin with words that, recorded centuries ago, still carry the weight of a mother's fury and fear. "You destroyers! When you came from my warm womb, one of you came out holding a clot of black blood in your hand. Now you have destroyed without thinking. You are like a lion that cannot control its fury, like a python that throws itself at the cliff, like a wild camel that kicks to pieces its own foal." Her words revealed her terror, not just at what her sons had done, but at what it revealed about who they were becoming. The steppes were breeding exactly the kind of men it needed. Merciless, calculating, willing to kill even their own blood to survive. But if Hoylan hoped to instill conscience in her eldest son, the steppes had other lessons to teach. The Taichud clan, who had abandoned them, heard that Temujin was growing into a young man. Perhaps they heard rumors of his growing reputation, or perhaps they simply saw him as a potential threat, a young man with a legitimate grievance who might someday seek revenge. Whatever their reasoning, they decided to eliminate the problem. A group of Taichud warriors raided the family's camp. Temujin tried to flee on horseback but was captured in the forest. The Taichud didn't kill him. Instead, they enslaved him, placing him in a wooden kang, a heavy portable pillory that locked around his neck and wrists, preventing him from feeding himself or defending himself without assistance. For months, Temujin was passed from one Taichud family to another, a living trophy and a warning to others who might challenge their authority. He was beaten, humiliated, starved. But he was also watching, learning, memorizing faces and nursing a hatred that would one day reshape the world. His chance came during a tribal celebration. While his captors were distracted by drinking and feasting, Temujin managed to strike his guard with his wooden kanga and flee into the river. He hid in the water with only his face above the surface. A young man from a family that had been kind to him during his captivity saw him hiding, but didn't raise the alarm. Later, that same young man helped remove the kangway and pointed Temujin toward where the Taichud had left their horses. Temujin stole a horse and rode through the night back to his mother's camp. He was free, but he was also forever changed. The experience had taught him something crucial. Loyalty was rare, betrayal was common, and survival required both ruthlessness and the ability to inspire absolute devotion in a select few. These formative years, from his father's assassination when he was 9 to his escape from the Taichud in his late teens, created the psychological architecture of the man who would become Genghis Khan. He learned that traditional tribal hierarchies were based not on merit but on birth and connections, and that those hierarchies could abandon you at any moment. He learned that survival required both individual strength and strategic alliances. He learned that mercy was often weakness, but that calculated kindness to key individuals could create loyalty stronger than kinship bonds. Most importantly, he learned to think systematically about power. The Mongol steppes operated on certain predictable principles. Tribes competed for resources, leadership depended on military success, alliances were temporary, and betrayal was simply another form of strategy. If you understood these principles better than your enemies, if you could predict their actions and manipulate their responses, you could turn their own tribal logic against them. By the time Temujin reached his early 20s, he was no longer the abandoned child crying on the steppes. He was a survivor who had internalized lessons that most men never learned because they didn't survive long enough to learn them. He understood that the traditional Mongol way of life, constant intertribal warfare, shifting alliances, blood feuds lasting generations, was ultimately self-defeating. The tribes were weakening themselves through constant conflict while stronger, more unified civilizations surrounded them. What Temujin began to envision was something that had never existed in Mongol history. Unity, not the temporary unity of a military campaign, but fundamental unity based on a new principle, loyalty to a leader and a cause rather than to a bloodline, meritocracy instead of aristocracy, a fighting force bound by discipline and shared purpose rather than by kinship. But before he could unite the Mongol tribes, he needed to build a following. He needed to prove that his vision wasn't just idealism but a practical path to power, wealth, and survival. The next phase of his life would be about gathering followers, making strategic alliances, and beginning to test his theories of leadership and warfare against the harsh realities of steppe politics. The abandoned boy was gone. In his place stood a young warrior with nothing to lose, everything to prove, and a growing understanding that the entire system of Mongol tribal politics was vulnerable to someone willing to think differently. The making of Temujin was complete. The rise of Genghis Khan was about to begin. By his early 20s, Temujin faced a fundamental problem. He had ambition but no army, a vision but no followers, and a name that carried memories of his father's modest status and his family's abandonment. In Mongol society, where a man's worth was measured by the warriors who followed him and the horses they rode, Temujin was essentially nobody. But he did have one crucial asset: a promise. Years earlier, before his death, Yasuge had arranged a marriage between young Temujin and a girl named Berta from the Olkhonut tribe. This wasn't unusual. Tribal alliances were frequently sealed through marriage arrangements. But for the abandoned Temujin, it represented something more valuable than romance. It represented legitimacy and connection. When Temujin was around 20 years old, he made the journey to the Olkhonut tribe to claim his bride. The fact that Berta's family honored the betrothal despite Temujin's fallen circumstances suggests something important. He must have already been demonstrating the charisma and presence that would later allow him to command armies. Berta's father, Day Sechen, gave the couple a fine black sable coat as a wedding gift, a luxury item that would soon prove instrumental in Temujin's rise. Temujin understood that in steppe politics, you built power through alliances, and the strongest alliances were with those who had power to share. He took the valuable sable coat and traveled to find Togrul Khan, the leader of the Kerite tribe, and a man who had once been his father's ally. It was a calculated gamble. Would Togrul honor an old friendship, or would he see Temujin as the nobody he appeared to be? The gift worked. Togrul accepted the coat and, more importantly, accepted Temujin as a sort of vassal or junior partner. He promised to help reunite Temujin's scattered tribe and provide military support. For Temujin, this was exactly the breakthrough he needed. He now had a powerful patron. Warriors seeking opportunity began to gravitate toward him, drawn by the combination of his own emerging reputation and Togrul's backing. But the steppes had one more brutal lesson to teach him about the nature of power and the importance of strength. Shortly after his marriage, Temujin's camp was raided by the Merkits, a tribe with an old grievance. Remember that Temujin's mother, Hoylun, had been kidnapped by his father Yasuge from a Merkit man. This was tribal justice working across generations. The Merkits were settling the old score by kidnapping Berta. For Temujin, this was both a personal catastrophe and a test of his emerging leadership. A man who couldn't protect his own wife had no business leading warriors. He had to get Berta back, and he had to do it in a way that demonstrated strength, not desperation. This was the first time Temujin demonstrated the strategic thinking that would later characterize his military campaigns. Instead of launching a suicidal rescue attempt with his small band of followers, he carefully assembled a coalition. He called on Togrul Khan to honor his commitment. He also reached out to Jamuka, a childhood friend who had become a respected warrior leader in his own right. Together, they assembled a force that vastly outnumbered the Merkit camp holding Berta. The attack, when it came, was devastating. The coalition force struck at dawn, overwhelming the Merkits before they could organize a defense. Berta was recovered, and the Merkits suffered heavy casualties. It was a perfectly executed raid, demonstrating everything that would make Mongol warfare famous: intelligence gathering, coalition building, speed, and overwhelming force applied at the decisive moment. Temujin returned victorious, his reputation significantly enhanced. He had demonstrated that he could inspire loyalty, organize military operations, and deliver results. Warriors began joining him in greater numbers, drawn by the prospect of plunder and glory under a leader who seemed to understand warfare at a deeper level than the traditional chiefs. But the Berta rescue had also planted the seeds of future conflict. When she returned, Berta was pregnant. She would give birth to a son, Yoshi, whose parentage would always be questioned. Was he Temujin's son, or the child of her Merkit captor? Temujin chose to accept Yoshi as his own, but the whispers never fully stopped, creating a succession problem that would haunt the Mongol leadership for generations. For several years, Temujin and Jamuka operated as allies, almost as brothers. They even performed the Anda ceremony, a ritual of blood brotherhood that was supposed to create an unbreakable bond. Their combined forces were formidable, and they achieved significant successes against various rival tribes. But two men of ambition cannot indefinitely share leadership. The partnership began to fracture over both philosophical differences and practical matters of authority. Jamukha represented the traditional Mongol aristocracy. He believed in the established tribal hierarchy, where leadership belonged to those of noble blood. His followers were primarily from established clans who had hereditary claims to status. He was, in many ways, the steppes' chosen candidate for supreme leadership, well-connected, properly aristocratic, respected by the traditional power structure. Temujin represented something fundamentally different and threatening to that established order. His followers increasingly came from the margins of society, members of conquered or scattered clans, former slaves, skilled individuals from humble backgrounds. Temujin promoted based on ability rather than birth. One of his most trusted generals, Jebe, had literally been an enemy warrior who shot Temujin's horse out from under him during a battle. When captured, Jebe admitted what he'd done and offered to serve Temujin with the same dedication he'd shown his previous master. Instead of executing him, Temujin recognized talent and loyalty and made him one of his greatest commanders. This meritocratic approach was revolutionary. It meant that anyone, regardless of birth, could rise to the highest levels of command through competence and loyalty. For ambitious men trapped in low-status clans, Temujin offered something no traditional Mongol leader could: the possibility of transcending the circumstances of your birth. The break between Temujin and Jamukha came around 1187, but sources differ on the exact cause. It might have been a dispute over where to camp, or a deeper conflict over a horse theft, or simply the inevitable clash of two men who both saw themselves as future rulers. Whatever the immediate trigger, the result was clear. The two former blood brothers became rivals for supreme leadership of the Mongol tribes. What followed was a period of escalating conflict that would last nearly 2 decades. Jamukha initially had the advantage. He commanded larger forces and had the backing of more established tribes. In their first major confrontation, Jamukha's coalition defeated Temujin's forces. Jamukha's response to victory revealed the difference between the two men's approaches to power. He ordered 70 captured leaders to be boiled alive in giant cauldrons, a spectacular display of cruelty designed to terrify enemies into submission. But the display backfired. Many Mongols were horrified by such excessive brutality, even by steppe standards. More importantly, it demonstrated that Jamukha ruled through terror. Temujin, by contrast, was developing a different model: strict discipline and brutal consequences for betrayal, but also generosity to those who surrendered and consistent reward for loyalty and competence. Over the following years, Temujin's following grew while Jamukha's gradually eroded. Warriors began defecting from Jamukha's coalition to join Temujin. Even clan leaders who had initially supported Jamukha began to reconsider. They saw that Temujin's forces were better organized, more disciplined, and more successful in campaigns. They saw that Temujin rewarded loyalty with concrete benefits: plunder, positions of authority, respect, rather than relying solely on hereditary obligations. Temujin was also forming a legal and organizational framework that would become the foundation of the Mongol Empire. He began establishing clear laws about property, loyalty, and conduct. Theft within the tribe was severely punished. Desertion in battle meant death. But loyalty was rewarded with unprecedented generosity. A warrior who distinguished himself could be elevated regardless of his birth. Plunder was distributed according to a system that rewarded bravery, but also ensured everyone received a share. This legal structure served multiple purposes. It created predictability, which is crucial for any organization. It reduced internal conflict over resources, and it reinforced the central principle of Temujin's emerging power structure. Loyalty to the leader and the organization superseded traditional tribal obligations. By the late 1190s, Temujin had transformed from a minor tribal leader into a major power on the steppes. His forces had won significant victories against rival tribes. He had absorbed conquered peoples into his growing nation, rather than simply raiding and withdrawing. He was building something that had never existed before, a multi-tribal Mongol confederation bound by law and loyalty to a central leader rather than by kinship and hereditary obligation. But he still faced significant challenges. Jamukha remained a rival, occasionally allied with other powerful tribes. The Tatars, who had poisoned Temujin's father decades earlier, were still a major force. The Nomad tribe to the west represented another powerful potential threat. And Togrul Khan, Temujin's former patron, was becoming increasingly concerned that his former protege was becoming more powerful than the mentor. The early 1200s saw a series of campaigns that would determine whether Temujin's vision of Mongol unity would succeed or collapse. The Jin dynasty of northern China, always concerned about steppe politics, played the various Mongol factions against each other. Alliances shifted. Togrul Khan eventually broke with Temujin and allied with Jamukha, seeing the former nobody as a threat to the traditional order. In 1203, Togrul and Jamukha's forces ambushed Temujin's army. It was a near disaster. Temujin's forces were scattered, and he was reduced to fleeing with only a handful of loyal followers. For 3 days, he and 19 warriors drank muddy water from a pool and wondered if this was the end. Temujin later referred to that pool in speeches to his followers, reminding them of how low they had been and how far they had risen together. A masterful use of shared hardship to build organizational loyalty. But Temujin's system proved resilient. His scattered warriors regrouped. More importantly, many of Togrul's own warriors, impressed by Temujin's previous generosity and organization, began defecting to his side. Within months, Temujin had rebuilt his army. He launched a surprise attack on Togrul's forces, catching them unprepared during a celebration. Togrul was killed in the fighting, and his Keret tribe was absorbed into Temujin's growing confederation. With Togrul defeated, only a few major obstacles remained. The Naimans represented the last significant Mongol resistance to Temujin's authority. In 1204, Temujin's forces met the Naiman army in a decisive battle. Jamukha, his old blood brother and longtime rival, was now fighting alongside the Naimans, one last attempt to stop Temujin's rise. The Battle of Chakimaut demonstrated how completely Temujin had revolutionized Mongol warfare. His forces didn't simply charge at the enemy in the traditional steppe manner. Instead, they used sophisticated tactics, feigned retreats to draw the enemy out of position, coordinated strikes from multiple directions, and tight discipline that allowed complex maneuvers in the heat of battle. The Naiman forces, fighting in the traditional style, were systematically destroyed. Jamukha fled the battlefield, but was eventually captured by his own men, who turned him over to Temujin, hoping for a reward. Temujin, true to his principles, executed the men who had betrayed their leader, even though that leader was his enemy. Disloyalty was the unforgivable sin in his emerging world order. Then came the question of what to do with Jamukha himself. The two men had been friends as children, blood brothers as young warriors, and rivals for supreme power for nearly 2 decades. According to the Mongol sources, they spoke one last time. Jamukha asked for the privilege of dying without having his blood spilled, a noble death reserved for high-status individuals. Temujin granted the request. Jamukha's back was broken, and he died as the sun set over the steppes, where he and Temujin had once ridden together as brothers. By 1206, Temujin had accomplished what no one in Mongol history had achieved. He had united all the major Mongol tribes under a single banner. The scattered, feuding clans had become one people. The endless cycle of blood feuds and counter-raids had been replaced by a legal code and a command structure. In that year, a great Kurultai, a gathering of all the Mongol nobles, was called at the source of the Onon River. There, before the assembled leaders of all the major tribes and clans, Temujin was proclaimed Genghis Khan. The exact meaning of Genghis is disputed. It might mean universal or oceanic or simply supreme. But the intent was clear. He was not simply another tribal chief. He was the Khan of all Khans, the supreme leader of a united Mongol nation. At that Kurultai, Genghis Khan established the formal structures that would govern the Mongol Empire. The army was organized into units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000, with clear chains of command. The Yasa, the Mongol legal code, was proclaimed, laws that would apply to all Mongols regardless of tribal origin. The Imperial Guard was established, composed of the most loyal and skilled warriors, serving as both an elite fighting force and as a living embodiment of the new meritocratic principle. Genghis Khan was around 44 years old. He had spent his entire life fighting for survival, then for power, and finally for unity. He had transformed from an abandoned child to the supreme leader of a people who had never before acknowledged a supreme leader. But even as the celebrations continued, Genghis Khan was already planning the next phase. The Mongol tribes were united, but they were still relatively poor, still confined to the steppes, still surrounded by wealthy civilizations that viewed them as barbarians. That was about to change. The wars of unification were over. The wars of conquest were about to begin. And the world had no idea what was coming. When historians try to explain how the Mongols conquered half the known world in just a few decades, they often focus on the wrong things. They talk about Mongol ferocity, about their willingness to commit atrocities, about their cavalry skills. All of these factors mattered, but they missed the deeper truth. The Mongol military was the most sophisticated and innovative fighting force of the medieval period. What looked like barbaric hordes to terrified chroniclers was actually a highly organized, technologically adaptive, and psychologically brilliant military system. Genghis Khan didn't just lead an army. He engineered a war machine that could adapt to any enemy, operate across vast distances, and maintain cohesion and effectiveness in ways that European and Asian armies of the time couldn't match. Understanding how he did this reveals why the Mongols were so successful and why even today, military historians study his campaigns. The foundation of Mongol military power was the horse and the composite bow. Every Mongol warrior was essentially a mobile weapons platform, capable of shooting accurately while riding at full gallop. They trained from childhood, spending more time on horseback than on foot. Each warrior maintained multiple horses, allowing them to cover vast distances by switching mounts periodically. This gave Mongol armies strategic mobility that sedentary civilizations simply couldn't match. But cavalry and archery weren't unique to the Mongols. Many steppe peoples were skilled horse archers. What made Genghis Khan's army different was organization, discipline, and systematic thinking about warfare. The decimal organization system was elegant in its simplicity. Every unit was composed of 10 soldiers, led by a commander. 10 of these units formed 100, led by a centurion. 10 hundreds formed a mingan of 1,000 warriors. 10 mingans formed a tumen of 10,000. This created a clear chain of command with manageable spans of control at each level. Orders could flow efficiently from the Khan through the generals to the individual warriors. Communication in battle was facilitated by flags, torches, and whistles, a signaling system that allowed complex battlefield coordination. But the genius of the decimal system went beyond communication. It created a structure where soldiers developed loyalty to their immediate unit, while also being part of increasingly larger formations. A warrior's 10-man unit became his brotherhood. These were the men he fought beside, ate with, and depended on for survival. But that brotherhood was nested within larger structures that connected him to the entire army, and ultimately to the Khan himself. Genghis Khan deliberately mixed warriors from different tribes throughout these units. Instead of organizing the army by tribal affiliation, which would have preserved old loyalties and rivalries, he intentionally created diverse units. A 10-man squad might contain warriors from 3 or 4 different original tribes. This forced them to develop new identities as Mongol warriors, rather than as members of particular clans. Over time, this integration created a genuinely unified military force rather than a coalition of tribal contingents. Discipline in the Mongol army was absolute. Desertion meant death. Cowardice meant death. If one man in a 10-man unit fled from battle, the entire unit could be executed. This seems harsh until you understand the logic. Mongol tactics required precise coordination and absolute trust. A single warrior breaking formation at the wrong moment could cause an entire strategy to collapse. The severe punishment wasn't cruelty for its own sake. It was the price of the coordination that made Mongol tactics work. But discipline was balanced with reward. Genghis Khan established a clear system for distributing plunder. After a victory, a portion went to the Khan's treasury, a portion to the commanding generals, and the remainder was distributed among the warriors according to their rank and contribution. Soldiers who distinguished themselves in battle received larger shares and could be promoted regardless of their birth. This created powerful incentives for bravery and initiative. The promotion system itself was revolutionary. In European and Asian armies of the time, command positions generally went to aristocrats or nobles, regardless of their military competence. Genghis Khan promoted based on ability, loyalty, and results. Some of his greatest generals came from humble backgrounds. Subutai, arguably the greatest Mongol military commander after Genghis Khan himself, was the son of a blacksmith. Jebe, another brilliant general, had been an enemy warrior before switching sides. Genghis Khan's willingness to promote talent from anywhere created a general staff of exceptional ability, all selected through the harsh filter of actual military success. Mongol military training was continuous and systematic. Large-scale hunts served as military exercises. The entire army would surround a vast area of steppe, then gradually contract the circle, driving all game animals into an increasingly smaller space. This required the same coordination, communication, and discipline as a military campaign, but with lower stakes. Young warriors learned to follow orders precisely, maintain formation, and execute complex maneuvers. The hunt culminated in the slaughter of the trapped animals, which also served the practical purpose of providing meat, and doubled as practice for the final assault on an enemy army or city. These exercises revealed another Mongol advantage: their ability to operate as a coordinated force over vast distances. European armies of the time struggled to maintain communication and coordination when different units were separated by more than a few miles. Mongol tumans could operate independently across hundreds of miles, then converge on a target with precise timing. This allowed Mongol forces to appear to be in multiple places simultaneously, creating confusion and terror among their enemies. The intelligence system supporting Mongol military operations was remarkably sophisticated. Before invading a region, Genghis Khan's agents would spend months or even years gathering information. They posed as merchants, pilgrims, or refugees, mapping roads, identifying water sources, learning about political divisions, and assessing military capabilities. By the time the Mongol army arrived, Genghis Khan often knew more about the territory than the defenders did. This intelligence gathering extended to psychological warfare. Mongol agents spread stories of Mongol invincibility and brutality ahead of the army's arrival. They exaggerated the size of Mongol forces. Sometimes the Mongols helped by having each warrior light multiple campfires at night, creating the illusion of a massive army. They ensured that stories of cities that resisted and were utterly destroyed circulated widely. The goal was to create such terror that cities would surrender without fighting. This brings us to one of the most controversial aspects of Mongol warfare, their use of terror as a strategic tool. When a city surrendered immediately and unconditionally, the Mongols were often surprisingly lenient. The city would be required to provide supplies, horses, and often young men for the army, but the population would generally be left intact. But cities that resisted faced annihilation. The massacres that followed the fall of resistant cities were systematic and purposeful. They weren't simply the result of soldiers running amok. They were calculated demonstrations designed to affect the behavior of the next city in the Mongols' path. Genghis Khan understood that killing every person in one city might save Mongol lives at the next 10 cities, which would surrender rather than face the same fate. This cost-benefit analysis of atrocity seems monstrous, and it was, but it was also remarkably effective. As the Mongol reputation spread, more and more cities chose surrender over resistance. From a purely military perspective, the strategic use of terror reduced Mongol casualties while accelerating conquest. Siege warfare represented a significant challenge for the Mongols. They were steppe nomads, expert at mobile warfare but initially lacking experience with fortifications. The great cities of China, Central Asia, and the Middle East had walls that had protected them for centuries. How could horse archers conquer such places? Genghis Khan's solution demonstrated his genius for adaptation. He absorbed siege technology and expertise from conquered peoples. Chinese engineers were incorporated into the Mongol army. They brought knowledge of gunpowder, siege engines, and sophisticated military engineering. Persian engineers contributed different techniques. Instead of developing Mongol siege warfare from scratch, Genghis Khan simply captured the world's best siege engineers and put them to work. The result was a hybrid military force that combined steppe mobility with sophisticated siege capabilities. A Mongol army could cross vast distances at speeds that seemed impossible, surround a city before defenders could organize, and then deploy state-of-the-art siege equipment to breach the walls. This combination was devastating. Communication across the empire was maintained through the YAM system, a postal relay network with stations approximately a day's ride apart. A messenger could travel from one end of the Mongol Empire to the other, covering thousands of miles, by switching to fresh horses at each YAM station. This allowed Genghis Khan to maintain strategic coordination across distances that would have paralyzed other empires. Orders, intelligence, and reports flowed along these routes, keeping the far-flung Mongol armies connected to central command. Mongol tactics in open battle were sophisticated and flexible. The most famous was the feigned retreat. Mongol cavalry would engage an enemy, then appear to panic and flee. Undisciplined enemy forces would break formation to pursue, expecting easy victory. Once the enemy was disorganized and extended, the retreating Mongols would suddenly wheel around, and additional forces would strike from the flanks and rear. The pursuing enemy, now caught in broken terrain or separated from their support, would be systematically destroyed. This tactic worked because it exploited human psychology. Soldiers in close combat are constantly managing fear. When your enemy runs, it provides psychological relief. Your fear turns to triumph, your discipline relaxes. The Mongols weaponized that moment of relief, turning it into a fatal mistake. Another key tactic was the use of multiple independent forces that would converge on a target. A Mongol campaign might involve 3 or 4 separate tumans advancing along different routes. hundreds of miles apart. Each force would devastate everything in its path, creating confusion about the main direction of attack. Then, at a predetermined time and place, all forces would converge, creating overwhelming local superiority at the decisive point. European military commanders who later studied Mongol campaigns were astounded by the level of coordination this required. Keep in mind, this was the 13th century. There were no radios, no telegraphs, no rapid long-distance communication. Yet Mongol forces separated by weeks of travel would arrive at the chosen battlefield within days or even hours of each other. This level of precision required careful planning, detailed knowledge of geography, and absolute trust in subordinate commanders to execute their part of the plan. The Mongol military also had surprising logistical advantages. Because they were nomadic, they didn't need the massive supply trains that conventional armies required. Each warrior carried dried meat, dried milk curd, and other preserved foods that could sustain him for days or weeks. Their horses could graze on grasslands, reducing the need to transport fodder. This meant Mongol armies could operate in territories where conventional armies would starve, and they could move at speeds impossible for forces dependent on supply wagons. When longer campaigns required more substantial logistics, the Mongols simply commandeered resources from conquered territories. Cities were required to provide food, fodder, and supplies. Conquered populations were put to work producing the materials of war. The empire essentially became a self-sustaining military machine, with each conquest providing the resources for the next. One often overlooked aspect of Mongol military success was their medical organization. The Mongols had military physicians, often captured doctors from conquered civilizations, who treated wounded warriors. This reduced mortality from wounds that in other armies would have been fatal, and it helped maintain force strength over long campaigns. More importantly, it demonstrated to the warriors that the Khan valued their lives and well-being, increasing loyalty and morale. The psychological profile of Mongol warriors was carefully cultivated. They were trained to be absolutely obedient to orders, but also to show initiative within their assigned roles. They were taught to view themselves as members of an elite force destined to conquer the world. They were promised wealth, status, and glory if they served well. And they were shown, through example after example, that the Khan rewarded loyalty and punished betrayal without exception. Religious tolerance within the army helped maintain cohesion. The Mongols practiced a form of shamanic animism, but Genghis Khan explicitly protected religious freedom for all. Christians, Muslims, Buddhists, and others served in the Mongol army without religious persecution. This wasn't idealistic tolerance, it was pragmatic. Genghis Khan wanted the best warriors and commanders regardless of their faith, and religious persecution would have limited his recruiting pool and created unnecessary internal conflict. The cumulative effect of all these innovations, organization, discipline, training, intelligence gathering, psychological warfare, adaptive technology, sophisticated tactics, logistics, and strategic coordination, was a military force that appeared almost unbeatable. From 1206, when the Mongol tribes were united, until Genghis Khan's death in 1227, Mongol armies won virtually every significant engagement they fought. They defeated the massive Jin dynasty army of northern China. They destroyed the Khwarezmian Empire, which had been one of the most powerful Islamic states. They ravaged territories from Korea to Poland, from Siberia to India's borders. Cities that had stood for 1,000 years fell within weeks. Armies that outnumbered the Mongols 5-1 were systematically destroyed. It's easy to attribute this success to barbarism or to some unique characteristic of steppe nomads. But the truth is more interesting and more relevant. Genghis Khan built a military system based on organization, meritocracy, technological adaptation, and psychological insight. He created structures that motivated warriors to fight with discipline and intelligence rather than simply with ferocity. He made systematic use of terror as a strategic tool. He gathered and used intelligence more effectively than his enemies, and he commanded a general staff selected purely for competence, without regard to birth or social status. The Mongol War machine wasn't a natural disaster that emerged from the steppes. It was an engineered system, designed by a genius who understood both human nature and organizational dynamics at a profound level. The fact that this system was created by an illiterate nomad who never lived in a city is one of history's great ironies. The man whom civilized societies dismissed as a barbarian had created a military organization more sophisticated than anything those civilizations had produced, and he was about to demonstrate what this war machine could accomplish when unleashed against the great empires of Eurasia. By 1207, Genghis Khan ruled a united Mongol nation, but it was a nation with very little by the standards of the wealthy civilizations surrounding it. The Mongols had horses, warriors, and mobility, but they lacked cities, agriculture, and the accumulated wealth of sedentary societies. Genghis Khan's vision extended beyond the steppes. He would use his perfected military machine to conquer the world. The first target was carefully chosen, the Xixia Kingdom, located in what is now northwestern China. Xixia was a Tangut Buddhist kingdom that controlled portions of the Silk Road, wealthy but not overwhelmingly powerful. It served as the perfect testing ground for Mongol siege tactics and for the integration of conquered territories into an expanding empire. The Xixia campaign, beginning in 1205 and extending over several years, revealed the Mongol pattern that would repeat across Eurasia. Initial raids probed defenses and gathered intelligence. Then came systematic campaigns targeting cities and fortifications. When cities resisted, they were destroyed with shocking thoroughness. When they surrendered, they were generally spared, but required to provide tribute, supplies, and soldiers for the Mongol army. By 1209, Xixia had been forced into vassalage, required to pay tribute and provide military support for future Mongol campaigns. Genghis Khan had demonstrated that his military innovations worked against fortified cities, not just in open steppe warfare. More importantly, he had begun accumulating the resources, wealth, engineers, soldiers, that would enable larger conquests. The next target was far more ambitious, the Jin dynasty, which controlled northern China. The Jin were a Jurchen people who had conquered northern China from the Song dynasty decades earlier. They commanded enormous armies, protected by walls and fortifications that had stood for centuries. They had sophisticated military traditions and vast resources. Taking on the Jin dynasty was the kind of challenge that should have been impossible for a steppe confederation. The war against the Jin dynasty began in 1211 and would continue in various phases for more than 2 decades. Genghis Khan approached it systematically. He couldn't simply ride into China and conquer it through mobile warfare. The Great Wall and the network of fortifications prevented that. Instead, he needed to dismantle Jin power piece by piece. The Mongol strategy combined military brilliance with psychological warfare and political exploitation. Genghis Khan learned that the Jin dynasty was ethnically divided. The ruling Jurchen elite governed over a much larger Han Chinese population that resented foreign rule. The Mongols exploited this division, presenting themselves as liberators of the Chinese people from Jurchen oppression, even as they burned Chinese cities. Early campaigns focused on breaching the Great Wall at vulnerable points and devastating the territory beyond. Mongol cavalry poured through gaps in the fortifications, raiding deep into Jin territory. Cities that resisted were besieged using Chinese engineers who had defected or been captured. The Mongols learned to use gunpowder weapons, siege engines, and sophisticated assault tactics. The siege of Zhongdu, the Jin capital, modern-day Beijing, in 1213, 1214, demonstrated how far Mongol siege capabilities had evolved. The city was surrounded, cut off from supplies, and subjected to sustained bombardment. When disease and starvation had weakened the defenders, the Mongol army, supplemented by Chinese infantry, launched the final assault. The city fell in 1215, and what followed was one of the most devastating sacks in history. The slaughter continued for weeks. The wealth accumulated over centuries was looted and transported back to Mongolia. The fall of Zhongdu sent shockwaves across Asia. The Jin dynasty capital, protected by walls that had seemed impregnable, had fallen to nomads from the steppes. If Zhongdu could fall, could any city be safe? But even as campaigns in China continued, Genghis Khan's attention was drawn westward by an event that would lead to his most devastating conquests, the Otrar affair. In 1218, Genghis Khan sent a trade caravan to the Khwarezmian Empire, a wealthy Islamic state that controlled much of Central Asia. The Mongol Khan was interested in peaceful trade. The Silk Road's riches could flow to Mongolia without the cost of military conquest. The caravan reached the city of Otrar, where the local governor, Inalchuk, accused the merchants of being spies. He had the entire caravan, hundreds of merchants, executed and their goods seized. Genghis Khan sent ambassadors to Shah Muhammad, too, the Khwarezmian ruler, demanding that Inalchuk be punished and compensation paid. It was a reasonable request according to diplomatic norms of the time. But Shah Muhammad, perhaps not understanding who he was dealing with, responded by having one ambassador killed and sending the others back with their beards burned off. A grave insult in medieval diplomatic protocol. This was the worst mistake Shah Muhammad ever made. He had insulted the Mongol Khan, violated diplomatic immunity, and demonstrated that he considered the Mongols beneath diplomatic consideration. Genghis Khan immediately began preparing for war, but this would be war of a different character from previous campaigns. This would be a war of annihilation, a demonstration to the world that insulting the Mongol Khan had consequences beyond imagination. In 1219, Genghis Khan led a Mongol army of somewhere between 100,000 and 150,000 warriors westward toward the Khwarezmian Empire. The numbers are disputed in sources, but what's clear is that the Mongols were significantly outnumbered by Khwarezmian forces, which probably totaled 400,000 or more. But numbers alone don't determine victory. The Mongol invasion of the Khwarezmian Empire showcased Genghis Khan's strategic genius at its peak. Instead of concentrating his forces for a single massive assault, he divided the army into several independently operating forces. One force, under his sons Yoshi and Chagatai, moved north along the Sir-Daria River. Another force under his youngest son Tolui swept south through Khorasan. Genghis Khan himself led the main force through the center. This strategy created chaos among the Khwarezmian defenders. They couldn't determine where the main Mongol attack was coming. By the time they realized that all the Mongol forces were main attacks, it was too late to organize coordinated resistance. The city of Otrar, where the original offense had occurred, received special attention. It was besieged for 5 months before falling in early 1220. Governor Inalchuk was captured alive. According to tradition, Genghis Khan had molten silver poured into his eyes and ears, the death of a man who had been blinded by greed and deaf to wisdom. From there, the Mongol forces proceeded to systematically destroy some of the greatest cities of the Islamic world. Bukhara, one of the major centers of Islamic learning and culture, fell in February 1220. When Genghis Khan entered the city's main mosque, he supposedly stood up in the pulpit and declared to the assembled population, "I am the punishment of God. If you had not committed great sins, God would not have sent a punishment like me upon you." Whether these specific words were spoken is uncertain, but they captured the Mongol psychological approach, presenting their conquest as divine judgment, making resistance seem not just futile, but impious. The city was plundered, many inhabitants were killed or enslaved, and the libraries, containing irreplaceable manuscripts, were burned. Centuries of accumulated knowledge went up in flames. This pattern would repeat across Central Asia. Samarkand, perhaps the greatest city of the Silk Road, fell next in March 1220. The Mongols surrounded the city with an army that may have included prisoners from previously conquered cities, forced to march in front of the Mongol forces to make their numbers seem even larger. After a brief siege, the city surrendered. The artisans were spared and sent back to Mongolia. The rest of the population was either killed or enslaved. The city itself was largely destroyed, but the true horror of the Khwarezmian campaign was still to come. When Merv, one of the largest cities in the world at the time with perhaps 1 million inhabitants, refused to surrender, the Mongols besieged it systematically. After it fell in February 1221, the slaughter was systematic and complete. According to Mongol records, which may be exaggerated but probably not by orders of magnitude, every living thing in the city was killed. Not just people, but animals as well. The city was then burned. Survivors who had hidden were hunted down over the following weeks. The destruction of Merv represented a calculated demonstration. Genghis Khan was showing the Islamic world what happened to cities that resisted. The message was clear: surrender immediately and survive. Resist and face absolute annihilation. From a military perspective, it was effective. Many subsequent cities surrendered without fighting when they learned what had happened at Merv. Shah Muhammad's military forces had been scattered and defeated in detail. The Mongol strategy of dividing their forces and attacking multiple targets simultaneously had made it impossible for the Khwarezmian army to concentrate for a decisive battle. The Shah himself fled westward, pursued by a Mongol force of about 20,000 under the generals Jebe and Subutai. These two commanders would lead what may be the most extraordinary military campaign in history. They pursued Shah Muhammad across Persia. The Shah fled to an island in the Caspian Sea, where he died shortly thereafter. Some sources say from exhaustion and despair, others from illness. With the Shah dead, Jebe and Subutai could have returned to the main Mongol force. Instead, with Genghis Khan's permission, they decided to explore westward. What followed was a reconnaissance raid covering about 8,000 kilometers through Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and southern Russia between 1220 and 1223. This small force of 20,000 Mongol warriors defeated every army they encountered. They smashed a Georgian army at the Battle of Sagim in 1221. They ravaged territories along the Caspian and Black Seas. They gathered intelligence about lands the Mongols had never seen. Before, in 1223, they encountered a combined force of Russian princes and Kipchak, nomads at the Battle of the Kalka River. The allied force significantly outnumbered the Mongols, probably about 80,000. Russians and Kipchaks against 20,000 Mongols. But Mongol discipline, tactics, and coordination were decisive. The Mongols executed a feigned retreat that drew the Russian forces out of position, then surrounded and destroyed them. It was a catastrophic defeat for the Russians, with thousands of nobles and knights killed. After this astonishing campaign, Jebe and Subutai returned east to rejoin Genghis Khan, having circumnavigated the Caspian Sea and demonstrated that Mongol forces could operate effectively in regions thousands of miles from their homeland. The intelligence they gathered would prove invaluable for future Mongol invasions of Eastern Europe. Meanwhile, Genghis Khan himself was completing the destruction of the Khwarezmian Empire. His son Tolui's force had devastated Khorasan, destroying cities like Herat and Nishapur. The city of Nishapur reportedly received especially harsh treatment because Genghis Khan's son-in-law had been killed during its siege. After the city fell, the population was systematically executed. Men, women, children, even pets. The heads were reportedly arranged in pyramids. The city was then leveled so completely that it was said you could gallop a horse over the ruins. These accounts of total destruction may be partially exaggerated. Medieval chroniclers often amplified numbers and horrors, but archaeological evidence confirms that many cities were indeed destroyed on a massive scale. The Mongol invasions of Central Asia resulted in demographic collapse, the destruction of irrigation systems that had supported agriculture for millennia, and the loss of cultural and intellectual heritage that can never be recovered. By 1222, the Khwarezmian Empire had ceased to exist. An empire that had seemed powerful and wealthy had been completely destroyed in less than 3 years. The psychological impact of this devastation rippled across the entire Islamic world. If the great cities of Central Asia could fall so quickly, was anywhere safe? Genghis Khan returned his attention eastward to finish the conquest of the Jin dynasty. The campaigns in China continued through the 1220s. The Mongols, now experienced in siege warfare and supported by Chinese engineers and troops, systematically reduced Jin fortifications. The war would continue after Genghis Khan's death, but by the mid-1220s, Jin power was clearly broken. In 1226-1227, Genghis Khan launched a final campaign against Xixia, which had failed to provide promised military support during the Khwarezmian campaign. This was clearly a punitive expedition. Genghis Khan was settling accounts with a vassal who had betrayed him, but he would not see its completion. In August 1227, while the campaign was ongoing, Genghis Khan died. The exact cause is uncertain. Various sources suggest he fell from his horse during a hunt, or that he died from wounds received in battle or from illness. Given his age, probably around 65, and decades of campaigning, any of these causes seems plausible. According to tradition, his final orders included completing the destruction of Xixia, which his sons carried out systematically. Genghis Khan's death was kept secret for weeks to prevent enemies from taking advantage of the news. His body was transported back to Mongolia and buried in an unmarked grave somewhere near the Burkhan Khaldun mountain, the sacred mountain where he had hidden as a young man. The burial location was kept secret. Reportedly, everyone who witnessed the burial was killed to maintain secrecy. To this day, the grave has never been found. But even in death, Genghis Khan's impact continued. He left behind an empire stretching from Korea to the Caspian Sea, with armies poised to continue expanding. He left behind a military system, a legal code, and an organizational structure that would allow his descendants to expand Mongol power even further. And he left behind a legend that would grow with each passing year. The conquests during Genghis Khan's lifetime were staggering in scope, but they were just the beginning. His descendants would build on his foundation, eventually creating an empire that would cover most of Eurasia, connecting East and West in ways that would permanently reshape human history. The death toll from Genghis Khan's conquest was enormous. Estimates vary wildly, but it's probable that tens of millions died either directly in warfare or from the famines and diseases that followed the destruction of cities and agricultural systems. In proportional terms relative to world population at the time, the Mongol conquests may represent one of the deadliest events in human history. Yet the same empire that caused such devastation also created the conditions for unprecedented cultural exchange. The Silk Road, protected by Mongol power, experienced a golden age. Ideas, technologies, and trade goods flowed between East and West. Chinese innovations like gunpowder and printing spread westward. Islamic scientific knowledge spread eastward. The Mongol peace, the Pax Mongolica, made transcontinental travel safer than it had been in centuries. This paradox, an empire built on unprecedented violence that also facilitated unprecedented cultural exchange, lies at the heart of Genghis Khan's legacy. He was both a destroyer and a builder, both a conqueror who obliterated civilizations and an organizer who connected continents. Understanding the Mongol conquests requires holding both truths simultaneously. The horror was real. Cities were destroyed, millions died, cultural heritage was lost. But the historical impact was complex. The world was connected, ideas flowed, and the political map was redrawn in ways that still influence our world today. The image of Genghis Khan that dominates popular imagination is that of the conqueror, the warrior, the destroyer of cities. But this image captures only part of who he was. The man who built the largest contiguous empire in history wasn't just a military genius. He was also an administrator, a lawmaker, and a political visionary who understood that conquest without governance is merely temporary destruction. The Yasa, the legal code established by Genghis Khan, was revolutionary for its time and place. Before Mongol unification, law on the steppes was customary and tribal. Different clans had different traditions, and disputes were settled through blood feud or temporary arbitration. The Yasa changed this by establishing universal laws that apply to all Mongols regardless of tribal origin. The laws themselves were straightforward and harsh. Murder was punishable by death. Theft was punishable by death. Specifically, stealing a horse could result in execution because in nomadic society, a man's horse was essential to his survival. Adultery was punishable by death for both parties. Lying to avoid military service, death. The pattern was clear. The Yasa prioritized social stability, military readiness, and absolute respect for property rights. But the harshness was balanced by universality. The same laws applied to everyone, including the Khan's own family. There are accounts of Mongol nobles being executed for violations that would have been overlooked in other medieval societies, where aristocrats lived by different rules than commoners. This equal application of law created a sense that the system was fair, even if it was brutal. The Yasa also established positive obligations. It mandated religious tolerance, a stunning innovation for the medieval world, where religious persecution was the norm. Christians, Muslims, Buddhists, and followers of traditional steppe religions all lived under Mongol rule with protection for their practices. Monasteries and religious buildings were exempt from taxation. This wasn't idealistic tolerance. It was pragmatic policy that reduced internal conflict and made it easier for conquered peoples to accept Mongol rule. Women's rights under the Yasa were surprisingly progressive for the 13th century. Mongol women had property rights, could refuse marriages, and could initiate divorce under certain circumstances. Rape was a capital crime. Women often managed household affairs and even military matters when their husbands were away on campaign, and in some cases, they ruled as regents. While Mongol society was still fundamentally patriarchal, women had more legal protections and social authority than in many contemporary civilizations. The environmental provisions of the Yasa reveal Genghis Khan's understanding of steppe ecology. Killing animals during breeding season was prohibited. Washing in running water during certain seasons was forbidden to prevent pollution. These weren't sentimental conservation measures. They were practical rules designed to maintain the resource base that supported nomadic life. Genghis Khan's administrative vision extended beyond law to economic policy. He understood that a successful empire required not just military power, but also economic infrastructure. The yam system of relay stations that served military communication was also open to merchants, facilitating trade across vast distances. Genghis Khan issued commercial passports that protected merchants traveling under Mongol authority. He reduced tariffs and standardized weights and measures to encourage trade. This focus on commerce wasn't incidental. It was central to Genghis Khan's vision. He understood that long-term prosperity came from trade, not just plunder. The Silk Road cities he conquered were valuable not just for their immediate wealth, but for their position in trade networks. By protecting merchants and encouraging commerce, the Mongol Empire could derive sustained revenue from taxes on trade, rather than depending entirely on periodic conquest. The postal system deserves special attention because it reveals Genghis Khan's understanding of information as a strategic resource. The yam stations, positioned about a day's ride apart, allowed messages to travel at unprecedented speeds. A message could cover over 100 miles in a day by having each rider switch to a fresh horse at each station. This meant that Genghis Khan could receive intelligence from and send orders to territories thousands of miles away within weeks rather than months. This communication network was essential for administering an empire that eventually stretched across Eurasia. Local governors could be held accountable because messages could flow to and from the capital. Military commanders could coordinate operations across vast distances. Economic information about harvests, trade conditions, and tax revenues could inform policy decisions. The YAM system was an information technology that gave the Mongol Empire capabilities that wouldn't be matched until the telegraph in the 19th century. Genghis Khan's approach to conquered territories was pragmatic rather than ideological. Populations that surrendered and cooperated were generally allowed to maintain their local governance structures, religions and customs as long as they paid tribute, provided soldiers when requested, and acknowledged Mongol sovereignty. Artisans, engineers, and educated individuals were often relocated to Mongolia or to other parts of the empire where their skills were needed. This created a multicultural administration where Chinese bureaucrats, Persian scribes, Uyghur translators, and Mongol military commanders all worked within the same imperial system. This meritocratic, multi-ethnic approach to governance was both a strength and a weakness. It was a strength because it allowed the Mongols to leverage the administrative expertise of conquered civilizations. Illiterate nomads could rule settled agricultural societies by employing literate administrators from those societies. But it was also a weakness because it created minimal cultural unity. The empire was held together by Mongol military power and administrative systems, but there was no deep cultural integration. Genghis Khan's personal religious views remain somewhat mysterious. He seems to have practiced the traditional Mongol shamanic religion, which involved ancestor worship and animistic beliefs about spirits inhabiting natural features like mountains and rivers. Burkhan Khaldun, the mountain where he hid as a young man and where he was eventually buried, was particularly sacred to him, but he was also genuinely curious about other religions and willing to consult with religious leaders from various traditions. He met with Taoist sages, Buddhist monks, and Muslim scholars. These weren't purely political meetings. Sources suggest he was genuinely interested in their ideas about morality, governance, and the nature of existence. He seems to have adopted a pragmatic religious pluralism. No single religion held absolute truth, but all might offer useful insights, and all should be protected because religious persecution caused unnecessary conflict. This tolerance extended to his policies. Christian churches, Buddhist monasteries, and Muslim mosques were all protected under Mongol law. Religious leaders were exempt from taxation and military service. This created a situation where the Mongol Empire became a relatively safe place for religious minorities fleeing persecution elsewhere. Nestorian Christians, for example, found refuge under Mongol rule when they faced pressure in other regions. Succession planning was one area where Genghis Khan's political genius failed him. Traditional Mongol practice was that the youngest son inherited the father's household and lands, while older sons established their own households. But how did this translate to an empire? Genghis Khan had 4 principal sons by his wife Berte: Yochi, Chagatai, Ogadai, and Tolui. The succession question was complicated by persistent questions about Yochi's paternity. Remember that Berta had been pregnant when she was recovered from the Merkits, and whispers suggested Yochi was the son of her captor rather than Genghis Khan. Whether this was true or simply malicious rumor, it created a succession problem. Chagatai openly despised Yochi, making their cooperation unlikely. Before his death, Genghis Khan designated Ogadai as his successor, a choice that suggests political wisdom. Ogadai was capable but not brilliant, ambitious but not ruthless, and importantly, acceptable to all factions. By choosing his 3rd son rather than following traditional inheritance patterns, Genghis Khan was placing ability and political viability over birth order. But he also divided the empire into appanages for each of his sons. Jochi received territories in the west, which became the foundation of the Golden Horde. Chagatai received Central Asia. Ogadai received Western Mongolia and parts of China. Tolui, as the youngest, received the traditional Mongol heartland. This division planted seeds for the empire's eventual fragmentation, though that wouldn't become apparent for decades. The last years of Genghis Khan's life were spent consolidating his conquests and planning future campaigns. He never retired, never settled into peaceful governance. War was his natural state. Even as he aged, he personally led campaigns or directly supervised military operations. The final campaign against Xia in 1226-1227 was motivated by their failure to provide promised military support during the Khwarezmian campaign. For Genghis Khan, this was an unforgivable betrayal. Vassals who didn't honor their obligations undermined the entire imperial system. The campaign was going well when, in the summer of 1227, Genghis Khan died. The exact circumstances remain unclear. Some sources say he fell from a horse during a hunt and died from internal injuries. Others suggest he was wounded during the siege of a Xia city. Still others claim illness, perhaps from an infection or epidemic disease. Given his age, mid-60s, and decades of hard campaigning, any of these causes is plausible. What is certain is that his death was kept secret for weeks. His sons needed time to consolidate power and complete the Xia campaign. According to his final wishes, Xia was to be completely destroyed as punishment for betrayal. The kingdom was systematically demolished, its cities destroyed, its population scattered or killed. Xia ceased to exist as a political entity. Genghis Khan's body was transported back to Mongolia, to the region around Burkhan Khaldun mountain. His burial was conducted in absolute secrecy. According to legend, anyone who witnessed the funeral procession was killed to prevent the grave location from being revealed. Some sources claim that a river was diverted over the burial site, then returned to its original course, making the grave impossible to locate. Others suggest the site was simply left unmarked on the open steppe. To this day, despite numerous expeditions using modern archaeological techniques, the grave has never been found. This itself is remarkable. Most important historical figures' burial sites are known. That a world conqueror's grave could remain hidden for nearly 800 years speaks to how seriously the Mongols took their obligation to protect their founder's final rest. The secrecy around his burial reflects Mongol spiritual beliefs. In steppe tradition, disturbing a burial site was deeply impious. By keeping the location secret, later generations ensured that Genghis Khan's spirit would never be disturbed. His connection to Burkhan Khaldun, the sacred mountain that had protected him in his youth and where he had prayed during difficult times, was maintained even after death. The immediate impact of Genghis Khan's death was surprisingly minimal, a testament to the strength of the systems he had established. The empire didn't collapse into civil war. Ogadai succeeded to the position of Great Khan in 1229 after a brief regency period. The army remained disciplined and effective. The administrative systems continued to function. The conquests continued. This smooth transition was possible because Genghis Khan had spent decades building institutions that didn't depend on his personal charisma. The decimal military organization, the Yasa legal code, the administrative structures, the communication networks, all of these continued to function under new leadership. He had created a system, not just a personal empire. But who was Genghis Khan as a person, beyond the conqueror and administrator? The sources are frustratingly limited. The secret history of the Mongols provides glimpses, but is hagiographic and focused on political events rather than personal character. Foreign sources are hostile and often inaccurate. What emerges is a portrait of contradictions. He was capable of extreme cruelty. The massacres of resistant cities were ordered by him and carried out with his approval. Yet he also showed personal loyalty to old friends and unusual clemency to enemies who impressed him with their courage or skill. He promoted religious tolerance while conducting wars that destroyed centers of learning and culture. He established laws protecting women's rights while building an empire through violence that killed millions. Perhaps the most consistent trait was his systematic thinking. He approached problems, military, administrative, legal, as systems to be understood and optimized. Traditional Mongol society was a system with predictable dynamics, and he redesigned it. Warfare was a system with principles that could be learned and applied. Governance was a system that required appropriate structures. This analytical approach allowed him to innovate in ways that his contemporaries, who relied more on tradition and precedent, could not. He also demonstrated psychological insight. His use of terror was carefully calibrated to maximize military effectiveness. His meritocratic promotion policies tapped into human ambition. His religious tolerance prevented unnecessary conflicts. His system of rewards and punishments created powerful incentives for loyalty and competence. Whether these insights came from natural genius, from decades of observation, or from the harsh education of his early life is impossible to determine, but they made him remarkably effective as a leader. The Genghis Khan, who died in 1227, had lived one of history's most consequential lives. The abandoned child had become the world's most powerful man. The illiterate nomad had created a legal code and an administrative system. The tribal warrior had united feuding clans and conquered ancient civilizations. His life had reshaped the political map of Eurasia and set in motion historical forces that would echo for centuries. But the story of the Mongol Empire was far from over. His descendants would build on his foundation, expanding the empire even further and creating a period of Eurasian integration that wouldn't be matched until the modern era. Genghis Khan's death in 1227 might have marked the end of the Mongol conquests. Many nomadic empires collapsed after their founding leader's death, fragmenting back into tribal components as leaders competed for succession. But the systems Genghis Khan had established proved resilient, and his descendants proved capable, sometimes terrifyingly so. The Mongol Empire's greatest territorial extent was still decades away. Ogedei Khan, Genghis Khan's third son, ascended to power in 1229 after a brief regency. He was perhaps not as brilliant as his father, but he was competent, relatively diplomatic by Mongol standards, and committed to continuing his father's vision of global conquest. Under his leadership, Mongol armies pushed deeper into China, further west into Europe, and south toward the Middle East. The conquest of the Jin dynasty in northern China, which Genghis Khan had begun but not completed, was finished by 1234. The Jin imperial court fell, and northern China came entirely under Mongol control. But this opened a new challenge: the Song dynasty in southern China. The Song were wealthier and more populous than the Jin, protected by the Yangtze River, and a geography that favored defense over the mobile warfare at which the Mongols excelled. The Mongol-Song conflict would last for decades, becoming the longest sustained military campaign in Mongol history. The Song put up fierce resistance, using their naval superiority on the Yangtze and their fortified cities to slow the Mongol advance. The war wouldn't conclude until 1279, long after Ogedei's death, but it began during his reign and absorbed enormous Mongol resources. Ogedei's most historically significant military initiative was the invasion of Eastern Europe. In 1237, a massive Mongol force under the command of Batu Khan, Genghis Khan's grandson, and the brilliant general Subutai invaded Russia. What followed was one of the most devastating invasions in European history. Russian principalities, fragmented and feuding with each other, were incapable of coordinated resistance. The Mongols used their standard tactics: rapid movement, superior intelligence, feigned retreats, and psychological warfare. One by one, Russian cities fell. Ryazan was destroyed in 1237. Vladimir fell in 1238. Kiev, the most important Russian city and the cultural heart of Orthodox Christianity in the region, fell in 1240 after a devastating siege. The descriptions of destruction in Russian chronicles are harrowing. Cities were burned, populations massacred or enslaved, churches desecrated. The Mongol invasion essentially ended the Kievan Rus period of Russian history. The political center of Russian civilization would shift northward to Moscow, which survived partially by its relative insignificance and willingness to cooperate with Mongol rule. From Russia, the Mongol forces pushed further west into Poland and Hungary. In 1241, at the Battle of Legnica in Poland, a Mongol army defeated a combined force of Polish and German knights. On the same day, April 9, 1241, another Mongol army destroyed a Hungarian force at the Battle of Mohi. This coordination across hundreds of miles demonstrated the Mongol strategic capabilities that had so often proved decisive. The European knights who faced the Mongols were unprepared for what they encountered. European warfare in this period was dominated by heavily armored cavalry and infantry fighting in close formation. Mongol horse archers, who could shoot accurately while retreating at full gallop, seemed impossible to engage. European commanders who ordered charges found their knights shooting at empty air as Mongol forces simply rode out of range, then surrounded them with arrow fire. After these victories, the Mongol forces were positioned to push further into Central Europe. The kingdoms of Germany and potentially France lay open before them. Western European chroniclers recorded terror and apocalyptic speculation. Many believed the end times were upon them. But then, unexpectedly, the Mongol forces withdrew. The reason was dynastic. Genghis Khan had died in December 1241, and Mongol law required all major leaders to return to Mongolia for the Kurultai that would elect the new Great Khan. Batu and Subutai pulled their forces back to Russian territory, and the invasion of Western Europe never resumed. This is one of history's great what-if moments. Had Ogedei lived another year, would Mongol armies have conquered Germany and France? Could medieval European kingdoms have resisted an invasion force that had smashed every army it encountered from Korea to Poland? The question is unanswerable, but it's worth recognizing how close Europe came to suffering the same fate as Central Asia, Russia, and China. Ogedei's death led to a succession crisis that would prove characteristic of later Mongol politics. His widow, Turagana, served as regent while different factions maneuvered. It took 5 years before a new Great Khan was elected, Guyuk, Ogedei's eldest son. Guyuk's reign was short and relatively ineffectual, and he died in 1248, leading to another succession dispute. Eventually, Mongol Khan, a grandson of Genghis Khan through his youngest son Tolui, became Great Khan in 1251. Mongol was capable and ruthless. He purged political opponents, reasserted central authority, and launched new campaigns of conquest. Under his leadership, Mongol armies finally began making serious progress against the Song dynasty in southern China. He also directed his brother Hulagu to invade the Middle East and destroy the remnants of Islamic resistance. Hulagu's invasion of the Middle East between 1253 and 1260 was one of the most destructive episodes in Islamic history. His primary targets were the Assassins, a radical Islamic sect that had long plagued the region with political murders, and the Abbasid Caliphate based in Baghdad. The Assassins were eliminated relatively quickly. Their mountain fortresses, which had seemed impregnable, fell to Mongol siege tactics. The sect's leader was executed, and the Assassins ceased to exist as a significant force. But the destruction of Baghdad was an event of world historical importance. Baghdad had been the capital of the Abbasid Caliphate for 5 centuries. It was one of the great cities of the medieval world, a center of Islamic learning, culture, and political power. The House of Wisdom had preserved and expanded knowledge from Greek, Persian, and Indian sources. The city's libraries held irreplaceable manuscripts representing centuries of intellectual achievement. In January 1258, Hulagu's forces surrounded Baghdad. The Caliph, al-Mustasim, seems to have badly misunderstood the situation. He had inadequate forces, but he refused to surrender, perhaps believing that the Mongols wouldn't dare attack the spiritual center of Islam. This was a fatal miscalculation. After a siege of 2 weeks, the Mongol forces breached the walls. What followed was systematic destruction. The population was massacred. Estimates range from tens of thousands to as many as 1 million, though the higher numbers are probably exaggerated. The caliph himself was executed, reportedly rolled in a carpet, and trampled by horses so that his blood wouldn't touch the ground. Following Mongol custom regarding noble prisoners, the libraries were destroyed. Manuscripts were thrown into the Tigris River, supposedly in such quantities that the river ran black with ink. This is likely an exaggeration, but the loss of knowledge was real and catastrophic. Centuries of accumulated learning disappeared in weeks. The destruction of Baghdad marked a turning point in Islamic history. The Abbasid Caliphate, though politically weakened for centuries, had represented continuity with the age of the Prophet Muhammad. Its destruction was a profound psychological and spiritual blow to the Islamic world. Some historians argue that Islamic civilization never fully recovered its former confidence and dynamism after the Mongol invasions. From Baghdad, Hulagu's forces pushed further west into Syria. Damascus surrendered without resistance, sparing itself Baghdad's fate. Mongol forces raided into Palestine and seemed poised to conquer Egypt, the only remaining major Islamic power. But in 1260, two events changed the trajectory of Mongol expansion. First, Genghis Khan died while campaigning in southern China. Once again, succession politics required major leaders to return to Mongolia. Hulagu withdrew most of his forces, leaving only a smaller contingent in Syria. Second, the Mongol forces that remained in Syria met an Egyptian Mamluk army at the Battle of Ain Jalut in September 1260. For the first time in decades, a Mongol army was decisively defeated in open battle. The Mamluks had studied Mongol tactics and developed counter-strategies. They matched Mongol mobility, didn't fall for feigned retreats, and fought the Mongols to a standstill. Ain Jalut marked the western limit of permanent Mongol expansion. The Mongols never conquered Egypt or North Africa. The defeat demonstrated that Mongol forces weren't invincible, that their tactics could be countered by prepared opponents. Perhaps more importantly, it showed that the Mongol Empire was reaching the limits of what could be controlled from a central authority in Mongolia. The succession after Mongkut's death led to Mongol civil war. Kublai Khan, another of Tolui's sons, claimed the title of Great Khan and had substantial support. But his younger brother, Arik Burka, also claimed the throne, backed by traditionalist Mongol factions who opposed Kublai's adoption of Chinese administrative practices. The resulting conflict lasted from 1260 to 1264 and permanently weakened central Mongol authority. Kublai Khan eventually won the civil war, but his authority was never universally accepted. The Mongol Empire was fragmenting into semi-independent khanates. The Yuan dynasty in China and Mongolia under Kublai, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, the Ilkhanate in Persia, and the Golden Horde in Russia. These regions acknowledged kinship and maintained some coordination, but they operated increasingly independently, sometimes even warring with each other. Kublai Khan's great achievement was the final conquest of the Song dynasty. The war had dragged on for decades, but Kublai invested enormous resources in building a navy and adapting Mongol tactics for riverine and coastal warfare. In 1279, the last Song resistance was crushed at the naval battle of Yarman. For the first time since the Tang dynasty centuries earlier, all of China was unified under a single government, a Mongol government. Kublai established the Yuan dynasty, moving the capital to what is now Beijing and adopting Chinese administrative practices while maintaining Mongol military supremacy. He promoted trade, rebuilt infrastructure, and patronized the arts. His court hosted travelers from across Eurasia, including Marco Polo, whose accounts would introduce Europe to the wonders of China. But Kublai's reign also saw the limits of Mongol power revealed. He launched two attempted invasions of Japan in 1274 and 1281. Both were catastrophic failures. Typhoons destroyed the Mongol fleets, storms the Japanese called kamikaze or divine winds, interpreting them as supernatural protection. Thousands of Mongol and allied soldiers drowned or were killed by Japanese defenders. The invasions demonstrated that Mongol military superiority didn't extend to naval operations in difficult maritime conditions. Similar failures occurred in Southeast Asia. Mongol forces invaded Vietnam, Myanmar, and Java, but found themselves operating in jungles and tropical climates that negated their cavalry advantages. These campaigns were expensive failures that achieved little permanent result. By the late 13th century, the Mongol Empire had reached its maximum territorial extent, stretching from the Pacific to Eastern Europe, from Siberia to the Persian Gulf. It was the largest contiguous empire in history, covering about 24 million square kilometers and ruling over perhaps 100 million people, a substantial portion of the world's population at the time. But this vast empire was becoming increasingly fragmented. The different Khanates were evolving in different directions. The Yuan dynasty in China was becoming increasingly Chinese in culture and administration. The Ilkhanate in Persia was converting to Islam and adopting Persian cultural practices. The Golden Horde in Russia was maintaining steppe traditions while extracting tribute from Russian principalities. The Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia remained closest to traditional Mongol nomadic culture. The second and third generations of Mongol rulers faced different challenges than their conquering ancestors. They weren't forging empires through warfare. They were maintaining control over diverse, sophisticated civilizations that often had deeper cultural traditions than the Mongols themselves. The assimilation pressure was enormous. Mongol rulers who wanted to effectively govern China needed Chinese bureaucrats and Chinese administrative techniques. Mongol rulers in Persia needed Persian administrators and Islamic legitimacy. Over time, the Mongol ruling classes were absorbed into the cultures they had conquered. In China, the Yuan dynasty became increasingly indistinguishable from previous Chinese dynasties, though with continued Mongol military dominance. In Persia, the Ilkhanate became an Islamic state. This process of cultural assimilation was gradual but inexorable. The unity that Genghis Khan had forged was dissolving. By the 14th century, the different Khanates were often at war with each other. Central authority from the Great Khan in China was nominal at best. The empire was fragmenting back into regional powers, though regional powers that controlled vast territories and maintained Genghis Khan's administrative innovations. The Black Death, which swept through Eurasia in the mid-14th century, was facilitated by the very trade routes the Mongols had protected. The disease likely originated in Central Asia and spread along Silk Road trade routes that were safer and more active than they had been in centuries. Ironically, the Mongol peace, the Pax Mongolica, enabled one of history's greatest pandemics. By the late 14th century, the Mongol Empire, in the form Genghis Khan had created, was effectively gone. The Yuan dynasty was overthrown by the Ming dynasty in 1368, ending Mongol rule in China. The other Khanates were declining or transforming into regional states with only nominal connections to their Mongol origins. The empire that Genghis Khan built lasted in recognizable form for less than 150 years after his death, a short period by historical standards. But its impact on world history was profound and permanent. The world that emerged from the Mongol period was fundamentally different from the world before it. How should history remember Genghis Khan? The question has no simple answer, because the man and his empire contain such profound contradictions that any simple judgment seems inadequate. By any objective measure, Genghis Khan was responsible for one of the largest death tolls in human history. The Mongol conquests killed tens of millions of people. Some estimates suggest 40 million deaths, which represented a substantial portion of the world's population in the 13th century. Cities that had flourished for centuries were reduced to rubble. The irrigation systems of Central Asia were destroyed, turning fertile agricultural lands into deserts that remain unproductive today. Entire libraries were burned, erasing knowledge that can never be recovered. The Islamic Golden Age, which had made Baghdad a center of scientific and philosophical achievement, effectively ended with the city's destruction in 1258. From this perspective, Genghis Khan is comparable to history's greatest mass murderers. The scale of destruction he ordered and personally supervised is staggering. The suffering inflicted on millions of people, killed, enslaved, displaced, or left to starve, is almost incomprehensible. Yet this same empire created conditions for unprecedented cultural exchange between East and West. The Silk Road experienced a golden age under Mongol protection. Merchants could travel from Europe to China with reasonable safety, something that hadn't been possible in centuries. Technology spread: gunpowder, printing, the compass, paper money, and numerous other innovations moved along trade routes protected by Mongol power. Ideas circulated: Chinese, Islamic, Indian, and European knowledge cross-pollinated in ways that wouldn't have been possible without the Mongol peace. The religious tolerance Genghis Khan mandated was extraordinary for its time, at a period when religious persecution was the norm, when Christian crusaders and Muslim warriors were fighting holy wars, when heretics were being burned across Europe. The Mongol Empire protected religious freedom. Christians, Muslims, Buddhists, and others practiced their faiths openly under Mongol rule. This wasn't tolerance born of indifference. It was explicit policy backed by law. Genghis Khan's legal code established property rights, reduced arbitrary authority, and applied universal standards that didn't vary based on aristocratic privilege. His meritocratic approach to military and administrative appointments was revolutionary. The principle that ability mattered more than birth was a profound challenge to the feudal hierarchies that dominated medieval societies. Modern genetics has revealed an extraordinary legacy. Approximately 8% of men living in the former Mongol Empire, territories representing about 0.5% of all men worldwide, carry a Y chromosome genetic signature, suggesting they're descended from Genghis Khan and his male relatives. If this analysis is correct, Genghis Khan has about 16 million living male descendants. This represents one of the most successful genetic propagations in human history, achieved through a combination of conquest, polygamy, and family members' elevated status over multiple generations. The political geography of Eurasia was permanently reshaped by the Mongol conquests. The destruction of the Khwarezmian Empire altered Central Asian power structures permanently. The devastation of Russia's southern principalities and the subsequent Mongol yoke of tribute and control lasted for centuries, profoundly influencing Russian political development. The end of the Abbasid Caliphate changed Islamic political structures forever. The unification of China under the Yuan dynasty, though temporary, had lasting effects on Chinese identity and borders. Mongolia itself venerates Genghis Khan as its founding father and greatest national hero. His image appears on currency, monuments, and government buildings. The transition to democracy in the 1990s was accompanied by a renewed emphasis on Genghis Khan as a symbol of Mongol identity and historical importance. For Mongolians, he represents not primarily a conqueror, but a unifier who took disparate tribes and created a nation that changed the world. In the territories the Mongols conquered, the memory is more complicated. Russians, Chinese, Iranians, and Arabs all maintain historical trauma from the Mongol invasions even centuries later. Yet there's also grudging acknowledgement of Mongol administrative innovations, their role in facilitating trade, and their religious tolerance. In the West, perception has slowly evolved. Victorian-era historians portrayed Genghis Khan as a barbarian whose empire represented a disaster for civilization. Modern historians, while not minimizing the violence, have developed more nuanced understanding of Mongol administrative sophistication, their role in connecting Eurasia, and their lasting impact on world history. Perhaps the fairest assessment is that Genghis Khan was a transformative figure whose actions reshaped human civilization at an enormous human cost. He was both destroyer and builder, both brutal conqueror and innovative administrator. He killed millions and connected continents. He obliterated cities and protected religious freedom. He was illiterate but established legal codes. He was a product of the harsh steppe environment who created an empire that would facilitate cultural exchange, unprecedented before the modern era. Understanding Genghis Khan requires accepting all of these contradictions as simultaneously true. The man who arose from abandonment and suffering to conquer half the world cannot be reduced to simple hero or villain. He was a human being who lived an extraordinary life in extraordinary times, whose decisions had consequences that echo through history to the present day. Nearly 800 years after his death, Genghis Khan remains one of history's most significant and controversial figures. His empire has long since fallen, but his shadow still stretches across Eurasia, visible in borders, in genes, in the very fact that he united East and West in ways that permanently changed human civilization. The world we live in today was shaped in part by a man who was once an abandoned child crying on the Mongol steppes, who became a conqueror whose name would echo through the centuries.